Very good morning, everyone. Warm welcome to the third day of our FDP on recent advances in biosimilar development. First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Srinivas Savale for accepting our invitation to be a speaker in this third day, first session. As a brief introduction, Dr. Srinivas Savale is the CEO of AAC LMCP Foundation, which is an Atal incubation center focusing on pharmaceutical and healthcare sector, hosted by LM College of Pharmacy, Ahmedabad, and supported by AIM Niti Aayog, Government of India. He is an acknowledged leader with over 22 years of professional experience in drug research, development, and compliance in pharmaceutical organizations, CRO setup, and academia. He has expertise in the areas of regulated bioanalysis, biopharmaceutics, and early clinical development, including bioequivalence for small molecules and biosimilars or biologicals, GXP compliance, including data integrity, gap analysis, and the resolution for electronic data workflow and IT systems in GXP environment, CRO or vendor qualification, electronic solution deployment for automation of bioanalytical or clinical laboratory workflows, clinical workflow, and has been supporting pharmaceutical organizations and CROs in these areas. He has been part of various startup and innovation related initiatives at LM College of Pharmacy, such as member of committee and mentor for SSIP and incubation center representative for IIC. He was also an adjunct professor, quality assurance. He was associated with Torrent Pharmaceuticals Limited as general manager, bioevaluation, Clinigene International Limited, presently as Syngene International Limited as head bioanalytical research, and Torrent Research Center as scientist 2 at medicinal chemistry division. He has received his PhD in pharmaceutical sciences from Gujarat University, Ahmedabad. He served as a track screening chair, bioanalytical chemical entity, abstract screening committee, AAPS Pharm Sci 360, and steering committee and member of clinical PKPD subcommittee, biosimilars focus group, etc. And he has been a reviewer for various national and international scientific journals, invited speaker at various national and international conferences, and has 22 publications to his credit. With this brief background, I invite Dr. Srinivas Savale for his talk on clinical development of biosimilars. Over to you, Dr. Srinivas.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Somasundaram. It's a great privilege for me to be part of this workshop. I'm in the AICT's FDP program. So I'll just share my screen and think, just confirm if you can see it. Yeah, can you see the screen?
Yes.
Yeah. So, first of all, good morning to everyone who has really shown interest to attend this discussion. So, in next 1 hour or a little more, I would like to touch upon clinical development aspects of biosimilars. I believe that you guys have already kind of listened to other speakers with respect to monoclonal antibodies and post proteins, and I think you also touched upon the Indian scenario of biosimilars. So what I'm going to do is to just give a perspective of how these biologics and biosimilars are gaining importance over the period of time. Like reflecting on the top drugs and the breakthrough medicines in recent past, and also walking through the biopharmaceutical research and development process. So as we have been seeing that with pandemic, many people have become familiar with biologics, especially vaccines, right? So we have been talking about biologics and then how to make these biologicals affordable to masses of patients. So that's where the concept of biosimilars has come in, and what are those biosimilars? And I'm going to focus more on the clinical development aspect. So we'll give some perspective on how the clinical development approach for the innovative biopharmaceutical and biosimilar differs. And I'll also quickly walk through the key steps and pathway for developing a biosimilar, especially from the analytical similarity to the clinical similarity. And then I will also touch upon some of the expectations when we are doing clinical investigations is for the pharmacokinetics of therapeutic proteins. And when we talk about establishing biosimilarity, there is always a need for having the clinical pharmacology, that is pharmacokinetic pharmacodynamic studies, where you have to establish the comparability between the biologic and the originator and the follow-on biologic. And then I'll give a couple of case studies, how the clinical development has differed with respect to the innovator filgrastim Neupogen and its biosimilar Zarzio. And there is another concept of interchangeability as far as the United States of America's regulations are concerned. So I'll touch upon interchangeability and also walk you through clinical development programs of a couple of interchangeable biosimilars that have been recently approved in US, and also briefly touch on the clinical development of vaccines. And finally, I'll just summarize what I wanted to share with you. So if you look at this slide, these are the top pharma drugs in 2020 by revenue, by sales, right? And out of this 15, you'll see that 10 drugs are biologics. Okay, I'll just try and use a pointer. So all those with blue stars, they all are biologics, right? And you can imagine the importance of biologics in the recent times. So it's not only like, as we know that the small molecule pipelines have been shrinking and shrinking day by day, and the biologics are coming out of patent. And that's where there is a huge opportunity for making biosimilars. So biologics are taking the center stage of late. As we see, Humira is the highest selling biologic or the drug with $20.4 billion of sales only in 1 year. Further, as we have seen in recent times with the onset of COVID-19 and then afterwards, in 2021, we have seen several vaccines that have come out. So all those are, I mean, biologics, right? So you have Pfizer BioNTech or Moderna's vaccine, you have Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, or even the Indian vaccines, Covaxin and Zycoid-D. All are based on, all are the of biologics, biological origin. Of course, there are certain antivirals that are being also researched recently by Pfizer and Merck. But then you will see that even for Ebola virus, we are getting a biologic treatment, right? So atoltizumab is the therapy that has been launched recently. And we also have seen the first malarial vaccine that has come out from GSK. Further, we have also seen that for some of the liver diseases, there is an investigational CRISPR therapy candidate which is being explored as a treatment for these diseases. And not only that, some of the rare blood disorders, such as like paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobinuria, is being treated by a complement protein C3 inhibitor, which is again biological in origin. And also for Alzheimer, also now there has been monoclonal, which is aducanumab, which is from Biogen Idec. So you can see that even the breakthrough medicines are also seeing several biologics, those are coming in forward. So when a biologic comes to a market, so how does this biologic gets developed? So all of us are familiar with this. You can say either funnel, you can say the process from discovery to market. So we see that at the drug discovery stage, you have several candidates through which they are filtered initially through the preclinical testing to look at the drugability and efficacy of these molecules or the biologics. I'm talking this as a generic drug development process, but the same what we see for small molecules, a similar path applies for the biologics. That's where you can see here I've used both the terminologies, there's a novel drug application and biological license application. So through preclinical studies, when we find some of these optimum candidates with less safety concerns, they get into the regulatory review, and before getting into the clinical phase, you submit your investigatory brochure as well as the safety data to the regulators, and you get permission to conduct clinical trials. And once it comes into the clinical phase of development, so we have phase 1, 2, 3, and phase 4 clinical studies that are being conducted for these molecules. So through the clinical development path as well, so you see that some of the molecules get filtered, and ultimately only one molecules makes to the market from almost 10,000 candidates. So in phase 1, I'm sure most of you know that we do a small study with maybe up to 100 subjects, where you are looking at initial safety testing for a small group of healthy volunteers. And once that is established, you move on to a little larger clinical evidence generation, where you assess the safety and efficacy in small group of patients. Now, depending on the nature of the trial, you may call them as phase 2A and phase 2B trials, as proof of concept and early establishment of the evidence. And then you move on to the phase 3 clinical trial, where you want to demonstrate the safety and efficacy in a large group of patients. Right? So once you have favorable outcome from the phase 3 with respect to safety and efficacy of the biologic, you get the license for these biologics to be marketed. But then your commitment doesn't end here. So once you got the FDA approval for marketing, then you continue the safety monitoring and research for this particular biologic uh, on the ongoing basis, and you need to you need to collect the data of the patient experience with this molecule or with this biologic, and collect this data and submit to the regulators. So this is ongoing safety monitoring even after marketing. So if you look at the various categories of biologics or biosimilars, the clinical development is always a stepwise approach, and it varies from case to case. So when we say biopharmaceuticals as a bigger class, so you have novel biologics and biosimilars. So EMA was the pioneer in getting some of the regulations or legislations for biosimilars in place. And as per EMA, uh, biosimilar is a new biological medicinal product which is similar to a licensed reference medicinal product, right? And the same thing when we talk in terms of US FDA's language. So US FDA also calls it as follow-on biologics. Earlier they used to have this terminology. So it is an officially approved subsequent version of innovative biopharmaceutical products which are made by different sponsors following patent and exclusivity expiry of the innovative product. So the very important aspect here is, sorry, the follow-on biologic is highly similar to the reference biological product, and you will say that there are no clinically meaningful differences between the biological product and the reference product in terms of safety, purity, and potency of the product. So this is very important and quite explicitly defined by US FDA. Of course, there are other terminologies like WHO refers them as similar biotherapeutic product or SBPs, and it expects that such a biological product must be similar in terms of quality, safety, and efficacy with the already licensed, well-established reference product. And the same category is referred as subsequent entry biologics in Canada, and in India we call them as similar biologics. So if we understand that biosimilar is supposed to be similar to the original originator product, but it's not the same, right? So there will be certain differences, but which ultimately should not produce any clinically meaningful differences. That's the bottom line. So when we are developing the biopharmaceutical, the clinical development pathway, if you can see this particular box. So It involves several types of studies. Right? So you have pharmacology studies, which includes PK and PD studies, efficacy and safety trials, as well as post-marketing safety monitoring. So here, if you look that whichever is in black, so those are the studies uh, which are required for both the innovator biologic as well as biosimilar. Like in case of PK, single dose studies are required for both. However, for the originator biology, we also need to have repeat dose studies and special population studies conducted. But for biosimilars, you have to have additionally comparability data, that is single dose PK studies, where you are comparing the PK after single dose of the follow-on biologic with the originator biologic. Similarly, in pharmacodynamics, you need to have appropriate markers to be studied. And again, for biosimilarity, you should have comparability pharmacodynamic data. When it comes to efficacy and safety, for novel biologic, you will have dose finding, schedule finding, various indications. So you need to have clinical trials for various indications. However, for biosimilar, you may have to go for pivotal trial for a specific indication. And of course, you need to compare a specific indication when it comes to safety and efficacy of the originator biologic and the follow-on biologic. Similarly, in post-marketing surveillance, you need to look at the safety and immunogenicity. I'll come to immunogenicity in little detail at a later point in time. And if you are trying to extend the application of biosimilar to different indications, then you also need to cover those indications in the study. So when we develop a biosimilar, the major chunk is taken by the clinical study. In the sense, I'm talking in terms of the timeline. So anywhere between, you can see here, like 9 months to 5 years, is the duration in which you are trying to establish comparability, clinical comparability with the novel biologics. So you have to demonstrate uh, PKPD equivalence by phase 1, phase 2 trials and safety and efficacy similarity with respect to, doing phase 3 trials. So you need to be very careful about selecting the indication as well as the trial design must be such that you have adequate endpoints addressed for comparison with the original product. And of course, post-approval safety monitoring continues, and that is also a requirement by the regulatory agencies. So when you compare the developmental path of a novel biologic or reference biologic versus a biosimilar, you can see it's like upside down pyramid in terms of the vigor of the activities or the efforts that are being put in. For a novel biologic, there are extensive clinical studies, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 studies, and to establish various types of clinical evidences. But non-clinical and analytical efforts are relatively less. But it is exactly opposite when we talk about biosimilar development. Give me a second. So the you can see here, in case of biosimilars, the clinical aspects are abbreviated, but you have very elaborate and extensive physicochemical characterization as well as functional characterization for biosimilarity. So there is, sorry. So actually biosimilar development path is relatively much abbreviated as compared to the novel biology, and that's where you can see that for a reference biologic, the probability of success is less than 10%, but that significantly improves in case of biosimilars. It can be more than 80% success rate if you have adequately strategized development of a biosimilar. So, as I was telling you, there is a stepwise development pathway for biosimilars, and it changes from case to case. The first aspect is the comparability with respect to chemical and pharmaceutical data, that is physicochemical characterization and biological activity as well as the impurities. The second important component comes is the non-clinical studies. Again, this depends on the nature of the biology that we are following. And here you may have preclinical PD studies, that is efficacy studies, and also toxicity studies to establish the safety of the biosimilar. But I would like to get more details of the clinical studies that are to be done. So for a biosimilar to be developed, you need to generate evidence, clinical evidence or comparability by PK studies. So those can be phase 1 safety studies or clinical comparability studies with different products. And also PD studies, pharmacodynamic study. And you need to conduct pivotal phase 3 comparability studies where you are looking at similar efficacy and safety for the follow-on biologic as compared to novel biologic. And of course, you need to look at the pharmacodynamic markers, but the uh, the strategy to select specific marker and the frequency to monitor those markers will vary case by case. So you need to look at when you are comparing with the novel biologic, you should see that the follow-on biologic has similar or lower adverse event incidences, and it may have similar immunogenicity profile with or without clinical consequences. So, and when you are looking at this is more from the PK/PD aspects and safety efficacy aspects, and you really need to continue your safety monitoring even post-market. So that's where immunogenicity and pharmacovigilance is another area that needs to be uh, implemented when you are developing a biosimilar. And immunogenicity being issue for all the biologics, you need to also have comparable immunogenicity aspects for the following biologic with respect to novel biologic. And it is recommended that minimum 12 months data is available for immunogenicity monitoring, and 24 months ongoing study is also conducted post-approval. That's a pharmacovigilance commitment when you get a marketing authorization for a biosimilar. So it is recommended that you minimize unnecessary switching between the products, right? And it's very important that you have complete traceability if you really want to get effective pharmacovigilance outcomes. And this is the concept which is called as totality of evidence, which actually, when you are establishing biosimilarity, you are collecting all the evidence, be it from the physicochemical characterization, biological characterization, non-clinical studies, clinical studies, immunogenicity studies. So this entire evidence is looked at collectively. It's not that one specific component, if you establish similarity, say for example, clinical similarity, that you can claim for biosimilarity. That is not the case. Here, entire evidence generated right from product characterization to this efficacy and safety, everything is compared in totality. And when you really want to extrapolate for a different indication than the indication which is there for the originator biologic, you really need to generate evidence for that. So let me touch a little more on the immunogenicity aspect. So, as you know, it is the most critical safety concern related to biologics, right? So, it is the propensity of therapeutic protein product to generate immune responses to itself or to related proteins or to induce immunologically related adverse clinical events. That is immunogenicity. And that is a major problem with respect to biologics. So there are several factors which contribute to the immunogenicity, which I'll come in the next slide. But then it is very important that you have to consider immunogenicity for comparability claim, especially when this biologic is administered uh, multiple times or repeat administration is required. Further, the physicochemical characterization is not sufficient because the complexity of the molecules and there is an impact on immunogenicity which cannot be excluded with reasonable certainty. Now, what I'm trying to bring here is smaller changes in the drug substance of the drug product may lead to immunogenic outcomes. So, only like if you have physicochemical characterization which is comparable, but that's why I was telling about the totality of evidence. So you need to collect all the evidence together and review it collectively for any safety efficacy concerns that may come up. So some of the, you can say, some of the ways the immunogenicity is observed is in terms of hypersensitivity reactions, infusion reactions, autoimmunity, and loss of efficacy. So to arrive at the immunogenic potential or to measure the immunogenicity, one has to have validated assays, which is again a big challenge. So this particular graph actually, this particular figure shows various factors which are affecting the immunogenicity of biopharmaceuticals. So there are four major classifications of the buckets of factors. There are product-related factors, process-related, patient-related, and disease state and treatment-related factors. So as you see here, the risk of these factors from low to high are graded here, right, in each category. So if you can see here, the native human protein may have less immunogenic potential as compared to the foreign sequences, right? You say when it comes to process-related factors, if you maintain the adequate storage conditions, you have less chances. But if you look at presence of host cell proteins or DNAs in your product, that may have immunogenic consequences, which are high-risk consequences. When it comes to patient-related factors, actually, there is an effect of ethnicity, age, gender, and so on and so forth, or even absence of indigenous proteins. But the patient-related factors are not that alarming. When it comes to the disease state and the treatment, as I said, single dose has less chances of developing immunogenic outcomes. But as you go for multiple dosing, then you expect immunogenic reactions. And when it comes to route of administration, IV route is the less immunogenic, least immunogenic as compared to intramuscular or subcutaneous route of administration. And the duration of treatment and autoimmune diseases, they also contribute heavily in having the immunogenic exacerbations. So, as I was mentioning about totality of evidence, there is another terminology of extrapolation, which these two I thought I will elaborate a bit. So, when we talk about evaluation of biosimilar, which is based on totality of evidence, so the data generated or the knowledge generated across all the phases of reference biological product is always taken into account when we are comparing. So you are integrating various kinds of evidence and making a regulatory decision, which is also applied for assessment of biosimilars. So it is very essential that you have robust analytical characterization, preclinical foundation, which will reduce the need for extensive animal and clinical testing. So that's what is done in case of biosimilars development. So one looks from all aspects of the product, be it analytical, be it functional, be it non-clinical, clinical, immunogenic potential, safety, alert, and in totality, then you can compare it with the originator product. And when it comes to extrapolating the use of a biosimilar for a specific indication, It is always essential to have scientific justification, right? If the indications and uses are not clinically studied earlier. So it is seen that you need to have convincing non-clinical evidence to support such extrapolation claims. But then when you have a different mechanism of action for that particular biology, then it is must that you generate clinical evidence to prove that the indication that you want to extrapolate to the biological work, the biologic will work for that particular indication. Now, I'm giving you the two terminologies that are being used in case of by USFDA. One is biosimilar, as I already mentioned. So they are highly similar to the reference product, and there is no clinically meaningful differences when it comes to safety, purity, and potency of the two. And another term is the interchangeable. So interchangeable biosimilar is a biosimilar product which can be expected to produce same clinical result as the reference product in any given patient and administered more than once, that the risk of altering or switching between the two is not greater than the risk of maintaining the patient on the reference product. So what does it mean is they're as good as substitutes of each other, right? So you can substitute the reference product with such interchangeable product, and there is no intervention of prescriber. Even the pharmacist can take a call on it. So all this data information is the designation, whether it is biosimilar or interchangeable, is given in something called as purple book. So we have orange book for other drugs. So purple book is mainly for biologics and biosimilars. So we had actually published one of the cover articles about clinical pharmacology studies to support demonstration of biosimilarity and interchangeability in AFPS magazine. So these guidelines of USFDA have evolved a bit now, and we have clear understanding of how to achieve or what kind of data is required for getting these designations. Sorry. So if I have to establish clinical evidence, especially for the PK of therapeutic proteins, what needs to be done? So there are several underlying aspects to it. So when you are measuring a particular biology in terms of its fate, the pharmacokinetics, you need to have a lot of importance given to the bioanalytical aspect. So the methodology, which is going to use either the PK markers or PD markers, I mean the drug or the pharmacodynamic markers, you need to have adequate methodology in place, which is validated and which is reproducible. So there is always a problem in terms of the endogenous concentration of therapeutic proteins, which needs to be tackled when you are doing bioanalysis of these therapeutic proteins. So what kind of data we are generating in specific clinical PK study for therapeutic proteins? So you are looking at this when you're comparing it with novel biology, you always have to have same route of administration. So if you are looking at absorption, of course, other than IV, you also get some understanding as to the differentiation between the products is when you are using different routes of administration. And you are also looking at disposition of the biology with respect to dose and time. You're also looking at binding to blood components, any chemical modifications or variability within the subjects or the populations. You're also collecting PK data for subpopulations, renally impaired or hepatic impaired patients. And then you also look at some of the interaction studies. And when it comes to data analysis, for conventional products, you can use compartment or non-compartmental analysis for pharmacokinetics. And if you want to characterize PK and other covariate relationships, you go for population PK analysis. So that is done typically for phase 2 and phase 3 studies where you are using a sparse samples approach. So that is what is recommended by FDA guideline. And it also asks that you need to establish PK-PD relationship. So you need to choose right PD biomarkers and correlate the PK outcomes and the PD outcomes to establish the relationship. And look at the immunogenicity and then have a comparability based on the PK-PD outcomes of this study. So this particular guideline also takes into consideration some of the key aspects with respect to quality. So it has described various aspects of the clinical PKPD studies and has actually taken into account 4 different situations or 4 tiers of analytical quality and similarity. As I mentioned to you, there is an exhaustive analytical testing done for biosimilar, right? So it is essential that you figure out at the analytical stage what is the degree of difference still persistent between the following biologic and the originated product. It is also called as residual uncertainty. So there are 4 major tiers considered. One is insufficient analytical similarity. So here you know that there is a noticeable difference between the two. So you expect that there will be differences in the safety and efficacy aspects. The next is analytical similarity with residual uncertainty. So there is analytical similarity between the two, but there are some modifications or some differences, though they are minor, they also bring in some uncertainty for comparable outcomes. The next is tentative analytical similarity, and last is the fingerprint-like analytical similarity. So when you have fingerprint-like analytical similarity, you are reducing the uncertainty. So more close the following biologic is with the originator product, you have more confidence in the clinical outcomes, so they may be similar. So how to design such PKPD study for this therapeutic proteins? So you have to actually look at population, or the study design should be such that it is sensitive enough to detect the difference right between the two. Especially the design should bring out in case of any clinically meaningful differences are there in the biosimilar and the reference product. So for PK similarity, you can do single dose randomized crossover studies if the half-life is shorter, and when you are actually expecting a rapid pharmacodynamic response. But you may have to go for parallel group design if there is a long half-life for that particular therapeutic protein, or there is an increased immune response which is expected, and you have that is affecting the PK and PD similarity assessment. When you go for PD similarity assessment, you have to look at the multiple dose design when the PD effect is delayed, or otherwise you may have to go for parallel study design where single dose drug PK profile is being studied. And it is important to choose the right comparator, like US FDA asks to use US licensed reference product. European Union asks, EMA asks to use European licensed reference product. So you need to choose the comparator product right from your developmental strategy. So, and if you want to have both EU and US, so you can always do a bridging study, which can be a 3-way comparison between US reference, EU reference, and the biosimilar. So when it comes to study design, so you can do in healthy subjects or patients depending on the outcomes that you are looking at. And you need to choose the dose which is most sensitive. So if it is patient-based study, you you have to use approved dose of the reference product. But if you are doing it in healthy subjects, you have to use the lower dose on the exposure response curve. And as I said, route of administration must be the same if you are comparing the route of administration for the reference product and that of the biosimilar. Now, when it comes to different endpoints of such PKPD studies, so you have, if it is a single dose study, you have AUC infinity as the endpoint for IV administration, while Cmax and AUC infinity for SC administration. When you go for multiple dose studies, so you have primary endpoints like area under the curve for the dosing interval at steady state, and secondary endpoints can become Cmax and Ctref, that is the maximum concentration, and the Ctref concentration at steady state. And the equivalence criteria is that 90% confidence interval for this primary parameter should be between 0.8 to 1.25. So when you are doing this, and when you are really looking at the PD data as well, so it is very important to have appropriate biomarker which will help you to establish PD similarity. Further, how do you select a PD biomarker for these PKPD studies? So it all depends on the time of onset of change in the PD biomarker, the dynamic range of the biomarker in which for a specific dose of a drug, how what kind of variation is expected in the biomarker levels. Further, you look at sensitivity of biomarker to differences between the products and how the biomarker is relevant with respect to mechanism of action, and of course the analytical validity of the assay. So these aspects will help you to select a specific PD biomarker. And of course, you need to judiciously look at what are the time points when these PD biomarkers need to be monitored. So you always have for this clinical PK pharmacology studies, the PKPD primary endpoints, and secondary endpoints become the immunogenicity and safety studies. And as I said, you need to have data in terms of neutralizing antibodies or immune mediated toxicity, which are actually you can say expressions of the immunogenicity potential. So I'm giving you an example when it comes to biologics development versus a biosimilars development. So this is a case of filgrastim. Neupogen is the originator trade name by Amgen. So this is a GCSF analog which is used for neutropenia. And for clinical development of the originator biologics, you can see here that phase 1 studies were done in patients, and further PK studies were done with continuous infusion of Neupogen, both single infusion and multiple infusion. And there were several clinical trials done to arrive at the safety and efficacy in target patient population. So you can see here 4 different types of patients. So a lot of clinical evidence was generated. Being a novel biology, you need to really establish a clinical evidence for a specific indication, and that's where you have multiple trials that are being done. But when it comes to the biosimilar, now Zarzio is the biosimilar for filgrastim. This is the first biosimilar approved in the US in 2015. So in case of Zarzio, there was exhaustive analytical comparability studies done with respect to structural and functional assays. Then there were 5 different animal studies were done through which pharmacodynamics, toxicity, toxicokinetics, and local tolerance was actually studied and compared with that of the originator. And there were very few clinical studies done. Like there was one pivotal and four supportive PKPD studies, mainly for establishing the comparability of key PK and PD. And there was one pivotal clinical trial was done, which is to compare the safety and efficacy of Zarzio with that of the Neupogen. So if you look at totality of evidence that I was telling you, so you can see here that first there is a structural comparison, or you can say that there are several methods that are being used to establish the amino acid sequence for this particular biology, like, and various techniques like Edman sequencing, peptide mapping, mass spectrometry, amino acid analysis are used to establish similarity, physicochemical similarity, followed by uh, exhaustive peptide mapping analysis was done to ensure that both the Neupogen and Zarzio has identical primary structures. So you can see here there are this is a European licensed Neupogen. This is two batches of US licensed Neupogen and three different batches of Zarzio. They were compared with respect to peptide map, and you can see they are like matching like fingerprint. So this reduces the uncertainty, and then you focus at something called as clinically relevant attributes of the structure or the characterization outcome. So here you can see that this part is zoomed. This is the Zarzio's main peak, and you can see the clinical relevant oxidized variants on the left side and not clinically relevant on this side. So when you are comparing with the reference, you need to also compare the clinically relevant and non-relevant segments of the information. And ultimately, at the end, if you see, you want to prove that they are highly similar, that has to be established in all aspects. Structural similarity, functional similarity, then PKPD similarity, and safety and efficacy similarities. So you can see here the hemoglobin levels after several weeks of treatment is comparable for biosimilar as well as originator product. And this entire information collectively gives us confidence of declaring this particular follow-on biologic as a biosimilar with the reference product. The second concept is interchangeability, right? So I was just explaining you that interchangeable biosimilar can be, I mean, it is the highly similar biosimilar which will work same way in the same patient as compared to the reference product, and even on the repeated administration. So basically here it is considered that for generating the evidence for getting the interchangeable designation, you have to undertake quite extensive studies where typically there are three switches involved, like switching from uh, originator to biosimilar, again to originator, and then back to the biosimilar product, and prove that it gives the same safety efficacy as compared to the reference of the originator biologic alone. And here you have to have descriptive endpoints of pharmacokinetics, pharmacodynamics, efficacy, safety, and immunogenicity. All these aspects are compared even after switching. And this is a typical illustration of that study design, where you can see that you are starting with something called as lead-in or run-in phase, where the patients are treated with the reference product, and at after the run-in phase, the subjects are randomized into two different treatments. One group continues on the reference treatment, and another group gets a first switch to test formulation of the biosimilar product. And after some time, again, you have switching to the reference product. Again, after sufficient time of treatment, this group is again switched to the third switch, that is again on the biosimilar. And after the entire study duration, then at the end of the study or the switching interval, you need to establish that the safety and efficacy is comparable for reference and the test. So that's, if you establish that, you may get this interchangeable designation, right? So there are a couple of examples. Again, very recently, Semglee, which is an interchangeable insulin glargine. Again, this is the first interchangeable biologic approved in United States in July 2021. Right? So this is nothing but this is an insulin glargine. The innovator is Lantus. The trade name is Lantus, which is originated Sanofi. Of course, this is a long-acting insulin for improved glycemic control, both for type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes mellitus patients. So here it was established that both Semglee and Lantus, they are highly similar in terms of clinical benefits. And this was done with respect to, there were several clinical trials done, which ultimately demonstrated that they are highly similar with respect to changes in the glycosylated hemoglobin and uh, the glucose levels, fasting and postprandial glucose levels from the baseline. So whatever, I mean fasting plasma glucose levels. So whatever reduction in fasting plasma glucose is produced by Lantus, similar reduction is seen after Semglee administration. And also there is a change in the HbA1c level, which is comparable. Now, this is with respect to the biosimilarity. So they conducted this first trial called INSTRIDE-1 in type 1 diabetes patients, where the primary endpoint was change in the glycosylated hemoglobin from the baseline to week 24. So 24 weeks treatment with both Semglee and Lantus was head-on compared, and you can see the data here. I can show that again in terms of the plots. So here you can see that the change in the HbA1c from baseline, this is week 24 and this is week 52 data. Blue is Semglee, gray is Lantus. So it has been said that there's a comparable change uh, in the HbA1c levels, both for Semglee and Lantus. And same thing is seen in case of the fasting plasma glucose changed from the baseline. So you can see here change from baseline for the fasting plasma glucose versus duration. So this is comparison of week 24 versus and week 52, and you can see the similarity between the outcomes of Semglee and Lantus. Further, they conducted, of course, I forgot to mention that Semglee is developed by Mylan in collaboration with Biocon in India. And so Mylan also conducted another clinical efficacy study in type 2 diabetes patients. So here also the primary endpoint was change in the HbA1c levels from the baseline on 24-week treatment, right? So here you can see that this is also a study where 560 patients were involved. Again, about 300 males and 250 females participated in the study. So you can see here, so this particular first upper part shows the comparison for the change in the HbA1c levels. So percent HbA1c change from the baseline. And you can see this is overall change, and this is in the insulin naive patients. So that is how Semglee stood as compared to Lantus, which is very similar. And when it comes to also looking at the self-monitored blood glucose levels, SMBG levels, there also it was seen that the overall change in the glucose levels and both, I mean, for all patients and for insulin naive patients. You can see the comparable outcomes we are seeing for Semglee as compared to Lantus. Then they also executed third trial in STRIDE 3. Here, the objective was to establish interchangeability. So they had generated evidence which shows that the products are highly similar and there is no clinically meaningful differences with respect to safety, purity, and potency. So what they did here is, again, the primary endpoint was HbA1c, which the change in the HbA1c from baseline to 36 weeks. Now this treatment was for 36 weeks. So as I was mentioning to you, so this was the study design that was done for this interchangeability study. So here what they did is from the INSTRIDE 1, that is type 1 diabetic patients, you saw that the first trial. So the patients who completed the Lantus treatment in the INSTRIDE 1 trial, where they were treated with Lantus for 52 weeks, right? All such subjects were selected for this interchangeability study. And then they were divided in 1:1 proportions and randomized. Half the patients were randomized for the reference, that is Lantus, and half of them went into the switching group. You can see here the first switch of Semglee for 12 weeks, followed by Lantus 12 weeks, and then Semglee for 12 weeks. So total of 36 weeks. So this switch arm is compared with the reference arm. And then the patients were followed up for another 40 weeks with respect to HbA1c changes and the glucose level changes. So this is very important aspect of an interchangeability study where you are trying to prove that irrespective of switching from like reference to biosimilar, you will get similar outcomes with respect to safety and efficacy. So you can see here the outcome, like week 36 change from baseline in percent HbA1c is similar in case of Semglee and Lantus. Now this is even after switching, right? And same is seen here, the values, percentage HbA1c values here. You can see that 12 weeks, 24 weeks, 36 weeks, the values are same. So that proves that irrespective of giving Lantus alone as a reference or switching it from Lantus to Semglee and Semglee to Lantus, you are getting the similar benefits, similar efficacy outcomes. And further, not only the efficacy aspect, but the safety aspect in terms of incidence of adverse events such as hypoglycemic events and nocturnal hypoglycemic events. You can see the comparison here. So hypoglycemic events anytime during the treatment for Semglee, again Semglee is blue and Lantus is gray. So you can see that there is a similar nature of these hypoglycemic events, and especially nocturnal events also you see similar frequencies over the period of 36 weeks of this treatment. So this entire evidence says that even if you switch from Lantus to Semglee or Semglee to Lantus, the patients are going to get the same benefits or same outcome with respect to safety and efficacy when you give Lantus alone. There's another example of interchangeable monoclonal antibody, that is Humira's biosimilar. It is, the trade name is Siltezo from Boehringer Ingelheim. Again, this is the latest approval by US FDA and first interchangeable monoclonal antibody approved in October 2021. So adalimumab is the generic name which is indicated for various therapeutic conditions such as moderate to severe active rheumatoid arthritis, active psoriatic arthritis, active ankylosing spondylitis, moderate to severe active Crohn's disease, moderate to severe active ulcerative colitis, as well as moderate to severe chronic plaque psoriasis. So, Humira is actually the trade name, which was originally developed by AbbVie. As you saw that this is the top selling drug in 2020. So now we have got Siltezo as interchangeable biosimilar for this Humira. This is going to benefit a lot of patients as the cost of treatment will drastically go down. So here also you will see that there were 3 phase 1 trials done in
Hello.
Yeah, can you hear me now? I'm so sorry. I don't know now where I left, but I'll share the screen again. Just let me know when was what was the last slide? Can you hear me and see the slide?
Yes, yes, I can see.
Okay, I don't know where I left.
I think it's completed. This all.
How about Siltezo?
Yeah, this also is.
Okay, okay. Then I think I just, for the fraction of time, I just lost. So, lastly, Boehringer Ingelheim conducted this Voltaire X trial. The purpose was to establish interchangeability of Siltezo with Humira. It was done in patients with moderate to severe chronic plaque psoriasis. And the primary objective was to establish PK similarity even after the switch. And secondary objectives were to compare safety, immunogenicity, and efficacy after the switch. So with this, you can look at the design here. So the patients were screened, and when they were enrolled, there was a 12-week run-in period where all the patients received Humira. And between week 12 and 14, there was first PK sampling done. for all the patients. And then the patients were randomized, two arms. So you have again 50% patients going on to the Humira arm and 50% on the switch arm. Here you can see that there are several PK sampling time points, those are given here. And as you see here, apart from the duration, that is 14 weeks to 30 weeks of treatment, both of reference Humira and the switch between Siltezo, Humira, and Siltezo. So there was a window period for collection of samples after the treatment. And this trial also had an extension period for the same arms. That is the last treatment in the switch is continued for another 16 weeks. And there was safety follow-up, which was continued for another 10 weeks after completion of the treatment. So in this trial again, you can say that this was a 50 to 58 week long study and having 10 weeks of safety follow-up. And actually the consideration here was you are looking at the PASI, that is the psoriasis area and sensitivity index as the primary endpoint. So here Siltezo was given as a prefilled syringe subcutaneous injection, and same is the case for the Humira. So you had Humira solution, again prefilled syringes and sub-Q administration. But in run-in phase, 80 mg of dose was given, followed by 40 mg, which is same for Siltezo also. So same route of administration, same dose, and same duration of treatment. And you can look here the endpoints that were selected for this study. So the primary endpoints for PK were at steady state, right? So you had Cmax and AUC tau for 32 weeks, the sampling time point. And then you had secondary endpoints, which are like 2 PK endpoints as Cmin and Tmax. And for efficacy, proportion of patients with 75% reduction in PASI at 32 weeks, right? So that was one of the efficacy parameters. And also proportion of patients with an static physician's global assessment score of less than 1 will again at the end of the 32 weeks of treatment. And for safety, drug-related adverse events were monitored during the treatment phase and also follow-up phase. And immunogenicity was also monitored or compared with respect to anti-drug antibodies and also neutralizing anti-drug antibodies. So this is also looked at after week 32. So all these endpoints were compared when the patients were on the Humira alone and patients were switched from Humira to Siltezo, then to Humira, and then to Siltezo. And it was found to be similar in case of all these parameter comparisons. So there are several such terminologies, country-specific terminologies. So we just saw interchangeability, and then there is a substitution, automatic substitution, and switching. So several countries allow some of these designations and some they don't. As I said, US has now started giving interchangeable status to the biosimilar. And there are several guidelines which elaborate on the clinical aspects of biosimilars, be it development of biosimilarity or establishing interchangeability with respect to different reference products. Now just coming to another class of biologics, that is vaccines, because we became suddenly very familiar with the COVID-19, these vaccines. Right? So typically, even vaccine development follows preclinical and then clinical development path, where you have phase 1, 2, 3, 4 trials. But additionally, some of the vaccines development, you may have these human challenge studies, where a vaccine is given followed by the pathogen against which the vaccine is designed to protect. But these are very uncommon studies because they present a lot of ethical challenges. So, just to give a perspective, traditionally, if you wanted to develop a vaccine, you go through this serial approach, like preliminary stage of antigen identification, then safety immunogenicity in animals, then move on to phase one safety immunogenicity in healthy, then go in phase two and phase three, and then sorry, once you get the licensure, you continue post-marketing surveillance. But of late, we have started seeing adaptive clinical trial design. So where you are actually not going in serial manner, but the trial design is such that you execute part of it, review the outcomes, adopt the learnings from whatever stage you have completed, and then again deploy those learnings into further execution of the trial. And then ultimately you analyze the data. So here you may not have, sorry. So these studies may be typically phase 1/2 or phase 2/3. So you are combining different phases of the study and building such decisions in the designs. That's what exactly we have seen when we have looked at the COVID-19 vaccines accelerated development. So you can see on the upper half, this is a typical traditional development of vaccine, which takes about 10 years to go to phase 4. But what happened in pandemic, in the accelerated development, you had many phases started in parallel, preclinical and phase 1, and then phase 1, phase 2, there was overlap, phase 2, phase 3 overlap. And parallelly, the manufacturers started building infrastructure for manufacturing large scale of vaccines. And regulatory review surprisingly continued from day one. So regulatory agencies got involved right from the early development stages, and that's where they could reduce the regulatory approval time. Like we have seen within a year also, some of the vaccines came into the market. But nevertheless, when they are distributed, the phase 4 phase has actually uh, been extended. That's going to be a longer process because some of the outcomes which are not probably addressed in the early phases need to be monitored in the market. So, though the accelerated program doesn't have the sequential approach, many steps were done in parallel. But this has also increased a lot of risk with respect to finances or financial risk for the manufacturers. And though this is an accelerated design, adverse event surveillance and safety monitoring, as well as long-term follow-up, was mandated by the regulators. So that's where you are not compromising with the safety outcomes or addressing the safety concerns of such trials. So that's where the phase 4 post-marketing surveillance actually became very, very critical and essential for development of these vaccines in a shorter time. So with this, I think I'm coming to the last slide. So in short, as we know that biopharmaceuticals are actually becoming future new therapeutic advances. And this is because many biopharmaceuticals are nearing the patent expiry. They have really created huge business opportunities for biopharmaceutical companies as well as CROs. But everyone appreciates that development of biosimilars is scientifically and technically challenging. It needs deep pockets, but it's worth pursuing now. And as we already saw that for establishing biosimilarity, you have to establish comparability with the originator product with respect to the similar nature in terms of quality, safety, and efficacy as that of the originator product. Further, as FDA mentions, that there should not be clinically meaningful differences between the follow-on biologic and the reference product with respect to safety, purity, and potency of the product, right? So one has to really generate clinical evidence if you want to get extrapolation for different indication or also get the interchangeable designation. And we have seen that development of more complex biosimilars like antibody drug conjugates or even vaccines will keep the clinical development programs and regulatory pathways very dynamic. But if you talk about equality of access to medicines, it is very important that you have to streamline the regulatory pathways for biosimilars. If the you need to really give access to these biosimilars to everyone globally. So that's in short what I wanted to cover today. Thank you for your patient listening and sorry for the technical glitch. I'm not sure if we have time for any questions. Otherwise, I'm open.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Srinivas, for an excellent talk on various aspects of clinical development of biosimilars with several examples of multiple clinical trials. So thank you very much. If participants, if you have any questions, you can ask.
Dr. Somasundar,
Yes.
may I ask you questions?
Yeah, please.
Sure.
So as I was listening that biosimilars, and I had a question for a long time, and I didn't have a proper answers to this. How much similarity is acceptable for to be a biosimilar? I mean, what is that Lakshman Rekha?
Yeah, as I said, typically the band is you have seen, right? 90% confidence interval of 80 to 125. That is given as a kind of a, you can say Lakshman Rekha is it should not be less than 80, not more than 125. So when we compare the
In terms of efficacy or in terms of structural similarity, in terms of toxicity, what type of, in all respect?
yeah, this is specifically with respect to the pharmacokinetic and pharmacodynamic endpoints.
PKPD.
So looking at the efficacy aspects of, and when you establish this efficacy, you are ensuring that the differences, the structural similarity and structural differences, physiological and I mean functional differences, non-clinical differences are also accounted for.
Yes.
So that's why I'm referring to that band because at each stage you need to take an informed decision on how much of difference I can go ahead with. So you have to weigh the risk. For example, analytical similarity. You see that for the array of tests that you have performed, you are able to establish say 90% of the tests you see similarity. Maybe one test, it has certain difference. So you need to weigh the risk associated with that difference. Will it kind of extrapolate to clinical differences, safety, efficacy differences? Based on that, you can take a call at early stages, analytical. But when it comes to safety efficacy, so you have currently given the band accepted globally is 80 to 125 is the band. So if you establish that, I think everything else is in.
Okay. Right. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Srinivas.
I see a question in chat box.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, which guidelines we have to follow for evaluation of biosimilars? Now, this is sad, but this is the fact that every country has their own guidelines. So you need to look at what is your target market and what specific requirements that specific country is asking for. I give you a couple of examples. Like if you want to develop a biosimilar for European market, they are asking you to choose European reference product. So then on, everything, your strategy changes automatically. Same is for the US. So if you are targeting US market, so every country has their own guidelines for establishing biosimilarity. Of course, like when I say European guidelines, they are applicable to a European Union, right? So, and even Australia. So to answer your question, so you need to first strategize what is the target market you are looking at and then refer to those guidelines.
Yeah, I have a simple question.
Yep.
So either you are developing a biosimilar or a biologic or any small molecule which is for prevention of an infection, like example COVID-19. Then in trials, how will you test this efficacy?
You mean in the clinical setup?
Yes, yes. You are developing a molecule or something which will prevent COVID-19 infection. So how can we test this molecule in clinical or preclinical phase?
Yeah. Now, prevention is actually your. It's a simple comparison. If I put
It is
in.
inhibiting the interaction of this.
Yeah. So one is you study mechanistically in vitro. Here there are several models which you can see that whether it will act on those targets.
Yeah.
Secondly, when you look at in vivo, probably your study design should be such that where you are saying that part of population is not put on the preventive therapy that you are proposing, and part of the population is not given on the that specific treatment. So it can be a placebo-controlled study as well, where you can see the propensity of infection is exhibited in one group, and when you are giving the preventive element or preventive medication, there you will not see the representation of the infection. Of course, you need to have, as I said, there is something like I mentioned in terms of vaccine trials. There is a challenge study. So that is also one kind of, like for example, you are developing a vaccine for prevention, and you challenge with the pathogen, and if it doesn't protect, it means the agent or the therapeutic modality is not effective for that particular infection. So that is another way of looking at it.
So we can do that challenging with that microbe or the antigen or pathogen. We can do that.
It was considered in